Hi YouTube, I'm going to show you some basic tree shapes today. If you've never done trees before, I think the main thing to practice is trying to get the flick for branches. So on this first tree that I'm going to do, I'll sort of explain that a little bit as I go along. So I do the trunk to start with, and then you can see there I just drag a branch out and I kind of lift my brush as I drag. And it's just getting that flick, because what happens is you start your branch and it's reasonably wide, and then as you do your flick outwards, because you're lifting the brush at the same time, the branch drags out to a finer point, so it tapers as it goes out. And that gets obviously a lot easier with time and practice. A lot of my students, when they first start doing these, their branches can be a bit kind of thick, and like they don't taper very much at all. So I would just recommend that you all just get a bit of paper and just start practicing trying to get this flick, because once you can get it, you can do all kinds of different shaped trees using this same sort of technique. So you can see what I'm doing here is obviously I got the main branches on first coming from the trunk, and then I'm just adding smaller and smaller branches as I go. And I suppose, like observing trees, looking at as many trees as you can a bit more closely helps quite a bit. So what I'm doing here, I'm just using a bit of this is I think this is sap green or olive green, just a little bit, just to do these kind of like swathes, like little brush strokes that kind of sweep across, really, to give you this kind of foliage effect. So the trees that I'm showing you here, these are all going to be sort of either background trees or kind of mid-distance trees. If you want to see a foreground tree, I've done another video to show you that. Well, one anyway, which I do with a sponge. Okay, this is a different type of tree here. So quite a lot of conifers have downward pointing branches. I mean, not all of them, but I'll show you this kind of typical one. This could be like a larch or something like that. And so you've got these kind of downward sweeping branches, and again, can you see I'm kind of dragging the branch down and kind of lifting the brush a bit as I go down, so that the branches taper to a point. Then what I'm doing, I'm coming back into each branch and I'm adding extra smaller branches, which is exactly what I did with the other tree. It's just that with the other tree, obviously all the branches were pointing upwards, and on this one they're all pointing downwards. So this just gives me my main kind of what I like to call like a tree skeleton. You've got to imagine your tree just as a trunk and branches with no foliage on it to start with, and then you can put your foliage on afterwards. And it's the same thing when it comes to the foliage. It's just practicing different kind of sweeps that you do with your brush that are going to give you the different effects of different types of foliage. So this one, all I'm really doing is kind of downward brush strokes over and over again, maybe getting slightly shorter as they get towards the tips of the the branches. And you just have to have a tree shape in mind. You just have to think, what overall kind of outline of a tree am I trying to get? And then this one obviously being sort of Christmas tree like ish, you're going for a sort of more of a triangular outline. So you have that in your mind as you're doing it, and that really helps get the shape in. And things like at the top of the tree here, obviously these branches are doing a similar way, but then the very top you might want to go just like over the point, to give a suggestion that there's a bit of foliage right at the top as well. You don't really want it to be bare branches up there. So obviously, if you can buy some books of sort of tree identification books, that sort of thing, they can be really useful, especially actually if you find ones that aren't photographs, but if you find ones that are illustrations that somebody's done in watercolour, that obviously helps you a lot, because you can try and kind of copy those to start with to give you a few ideas. and then you can start either making your own ones up or going from photographs. Okay, here's another type of conifer. Some trees are obviously easier to do than others, and this is going to be a Scots Pine, so these are particularly easy because they're really tall, and the mature trees, I mean, they start off looking a little bit actually like the one that I've just done when they're younger trees, but when they're adult trees, they're just really long and spindly, and they're mainly all trunk really. You just get a bit of foliage on the top, like a sort of a little platform on the top. So yeah, that sort of thing's really easy, and obviously just doing one or two isn't going to take you very long, but if you wanted to do a whole scene of a bit of heathland or something, all covered in these Scots pines, you can really kind of build them up and make quite an interesting scene. So look, again with the brush strokes here, all I'm really doing is kind of trying to make it look, I suppose, sort of like tufty in a way, just by doing these little brush strokes, again sort of pointing upwards to give it a kind of, I suppose, a kind of sort of prickly kind of look to it. It's just about giving it a bit of texture. I've done all this video obviously real time, so you can see how long it takes me to do these kind of trees. Most of them are pretty quick, and if you're doing like a foreground tree, you put quite a bit more effort into them. You do things like shadows on the trunks, you can build up bark texture and that kind of thing, and that obviously opens up whole other avenues of how you're going to paint your trees. But with these kind of background or mid-ground ones, you don't need to do too much with them. Right, this tree is going to be a sort of an oak kind of effect, so this is just to show you that I'm doing the same sort of thing with my branches. Do you see, like stepping one to the next one? But what I'm doing this time is I'm using my brush more sort of on its side, slightly more on its side, and I'm just wiggling the brush as I apply my kind of branch stroke, and that just gives you that sort of knobbly look to the branches. Okay, so instead of having like straight looking branches, they just become kind of bumpy and a bit more gnarled. And this is where, if you had a photograph of an oak tree in front of you, you could do this effect, but you'd obviously probably end up with a much more realistic result because you're copying one from real life. If you do this sort of thing, I suppose it doesn't matter quite so much in a painting if it's much further back in the distance, but if you were doing an oak tree as a foreground tree and you want it to be sort of hyper realistic, you are better off either sitting in real life and doing one from life or working from a photograph. So here you can do the same sort of thing to the trunk. You can pull it down, you can make it really kind of bumpy and gnarled looking. You could do like old branches that have snapped off and things like that. Anything to kind of make it look a bit older really. And again, if you're doing this as a foreground tree, you could put a lot of detail into the bark texture. You could do things like the roots and kind of hollow bits, holes in the trunk and that sort of thing. And they quite often have those holes at the base of the tree as well. You could put that kind of thing, and that all adds to it. Okay, so here the foliage, I'm just doing rounded sweeps, so you get that again. You get that sort of curved, bumpy effect to the overall look of the tree. So various trees. I mean, I can't show you loads of trees today, but I'll show you a few of the main kind of shapes. But obviously, you get trees that are spiky looking, don't you? You get trees that are a bit softer and more rounded, and like sort of anything in between really. And yeah, ones with leaves that, or branches that point upwards, ones that point downwards, and again anything in between really, all different angles. Right, here I'm coming in with a bit of dark green, just to put some ivy on it, because quite often obviously ivy grows up oak trees, so you can see this is really quick to do. So even with a sort of background or middle ground tree, you can still put a bit of ivy on it just to give it a bit of extra texture really. makes it look a bit older as well. Right, so you can see already, you know, I've done a few different shaped trees, but technically they're all kind of similar in that, you know, they all branch, and the branches then branch, do you see what I mean? And then those branches can branch again, and you can just keep building up as much detail as you want. So here we've got like a weeping willow. So with this, obviously you get your upright in to start with, your trunk going up, and then you just do these sweeps. So it's just, again, like get the main kind of 3 or 4 sweeps in, and then start branching those off, and just make sure that every brush stroke you do just sweeps and points downwards. Then that'll give you your sort of skeleton shape of the tree, and then you can add your foliage over the top, which I'll show you in a second. There's so many ways of adding foliage as well. Obviously I suppose the ultimate thing is to try practicing using brushes to get the effects, but you can use sponges and things, and I mean I'll show you a bit of that later. Anything that's going to add a bit of texture, really. Some people paint, you know, with like palette knives or credit cards, or you know, anything to kind of get the paint on the paper. So here, I mean, I'm using the same brush for everything on this, just to give you an idea. This is a number 2 size brush. The main reason I'm using this one is just because it's got a good point on it, so it's good for doing kind of branches and things, just to get the tapered effect. So here you can see all I'm doing really is going over the sweeps that I've done for the branches, and just giving it a kind of a wider sweep than the branch was, and the branches would have dried enough that they'll show up underneath this lighter green that I'm putting on, and quite a lot of weeping willows have you know, lots of gaps in them where you can see the sky coming through. All these trees that I'm doing, I'm just doing them cut to white to give you an idea of the tree shapes, but there's no reason why you couldn't, you know, if you're doing a painting, you could do like a sort of pale blue sky first, and then you can paint your tree over the top of that, and that will work and give you a realistic kind of background as well, have a nice sky in there. Well, you can't really make this out too well on my video, unfortunately, but I'm using more of a purpley colour here. This is actually violet. Violet on its own is pretty strong, so I mix a tiny bit of English red in with it, and that neutralises the violet quite a bit. But what I was trying to show you was that, especially for background trees, if you use colours that you wouldn't normally think to use, like things like purples, greys and blues, that kind of thing, that can really make your trees look like they're further back, so it can really kind of give you a sense of distance in your pictures. And again, like I'm just putting some sweeps on this for a bit of foliage. So you've got to decide, you know, what time of year you want it to be. If you want to do some you know, skeleton trees and leave them wintry looking, you don't even necessarily have to put any foliage on them, do you? You could just leave them just as the branches, and that would be enough. But do you see, although the purple doesn't show up particularly well in this video, you can see how that tree compared to the one next to it looks a lot fainter, and you can see how that would look like it was much further back in an image. And quite often in a painting you try and get warmer colours in the foreground and cooler colours in the background, and that again helps give it a sense of distance. So yeah, you could go, you know, bluer, like a bluer purple, or even, you know, just straight blues, to do trees that were even further back than that one, and that would help. Right, this is I'm doing a poplar here, so you can see the tree branches, similar sort of thing, but this time I'm dragging the branches upwards and I'm going for this overall kind of, you know, pointy shape. So you get your sort of main trunk on, and the main trunk doesn't have to be solid all the way up. You could just draw it or paint it like I have, sort of halfway up, and then start having branches coming from that. because quite a lot of this gets covered with the foliage now anyway. So that again gives you your main kind of skeleton shape. Now I use a slightly darker green watered down for my sweeps on this one. I probably could have used a bigger brush actually to get better sweeps on this, but I was just trying to stick with the same brush just to show you, what you can achieve just with one size. So yeah, these getting used to the colours that trees normally are helps as well. So with these poplar trees, they do tend to be a much sort of darker green, and that can be useful. And obviously with conifers, you get these darker greens, or you get a lot of sort of bluer greens or greyer greens, and that can make quite a difference to the overall look and make it look a bit more realistic. But yeah, if you've got a spare bit of paper and you can practice literally just doing branches and things, and trying to get them to taper, just trying to get the flick right. It's also about knowing how much paint you've got to have on your brush and how thick the paint needs to be, because if you add too much pigment, obviously the paint doesn't flow very well. And if you add too much water, it's so kind of watery that your branches and things don't show up very well, which would be fine if you were doing a really far distant tree, but if you want it to be more in the middle distance, you might want to make it a bit stronger. Okay, so this one, what I'm doing, I've got a sort of a top level in mind, and I'm just trying to get all my branches to go upwards towards where I want this kind of top level to be. So almost like, imagine like a sort of a mushroom shape in your mind, with that kind of flat top to it. That's what I'm kind of going for, and just going out towards that top platform. So this could be like a the sort of tree like you get out in Africa or that sort of thing. And again, I'll do some sweeps on this with my brush. You could spend a lot of time doing, more textured kind of foliage and things on these trees. But for a quick tree, if you just wanted to do a loose watercolour, these kind of things with the quicker sweeps are really kind of effective, and really fast to do. Just very satisfying as well when you do them and they work nicely. You can get almost as much enjoyment as when you do a sort of hyper realistic tree. Okay, so you can see like it's a good idea not to kind of faff about too much with these kind of sweeps that you do. If you put them on spontaneously, try and get them on fast, and then just leave them alone, try not to touch them too much. That can give you a better effect quite often. Easier said than done, I know. Okay, this is just showing you branches. So look, this, if you're practicing branches, this is a good one to do, where you just literally do, a branch going upwards, like a vertical one, and then just step your next branches like I've just done. And then on each of those branches, try getting smaller, like I'm doing here. So again, you're stepping on these ones as well. You do one, step to the next side, step to the next side, step to the next side, getting smaller and smaller each time. And this helps you practice, obviously not just dragging to a point, but actually getting smaller and smaller with your branches. And obviously that's useful on any tree that you're doing, but even just a little practice one like this, it's quite handy. Okay, so that gives me a sort of oval shape, and any painting that you're doing, quite often you end up with a gap somewhere, especially like in the foreground actually, where you think, oh, what can I put in here, and it might just be that like a branch coming in from the bottom of the painting or coming in from the side of the painting or whatever can add a bit of texture. So these sorts of things are quite useful actually, just to add in. You can see here I'm just adding a bit of foliage, just dragging these to a point, and that sort of gives a different kind of look as well. So with most of these trees I'm just using, you know, one colour, or maybe a couple of colours if I use a bit of the branch colour as well to add into it. But you could use as many colours as you want. And the other thing is that I haven't touched on is sort of autumn trees. I'm just using greens and browns for these, but you could use like yellows and oranges and reds and things just to get an autumn effect, and that can be really nice. So here's another one where I'm just doing branches and I'm trying to make them a bit more kind of angular. That can be quite a nice thing to do as well, where you kind of step them and the branches almost make kind of zigzags and things as they go up. It is just practicing different types of flick, really. And I know that sounds easier than it probably is, especially if you're like a complete beginner at it. You might get frustrated for a little while when you first start because your brush isn't doing what you want it to. But honestly, like, do a few and then it just becomes natural pretty quickly. Okay, here's a bit of sponge, and I'm just going to dab it in the paint, and I always do like a little test on a spare bit of paper to see what it's looking like before I apply it to the tree, just in case, and also so it doesn't just go blob on the tree and you get a big blob of paint. And all I'm doing there is just really going around the outside kind of edge of the bush, really, just to give it a bit of texture. So sponging can be really good, and I recommend these little flat sponges that you buy for floor mops, because you can get about, I think it's about £5 for a pound or something. They're really cheap, but also because they're flat and your surface of your paper is flat, they adhere really nicely. So actually I find they work better than kind of natural sponges, which are rounded and quite often don't kind of adhere to the paper very well at all. And the other thing is, with those flat floor mop sponges, they've got quite a lot of good holes in, really good texture, and that can really obviously help the effect of foliage and things that you're doing. Right, this is what I was saying about doing branches just coming in from the side or something. Quite often you'll have a gap somewhere in your painting that you don't like very much, or you'll make a mistake somewhere in your painting and you'll need to cover it up with something, and a branch coming in from the side or from the top, or you know, because quite often if you're doing a sky, sometimes that can go a bit patchy, or you know, you can do something that you don't want in the sky, so you could just have a branch hanging down over it to cover it up. That can be very useful. And here I'm just dragging a few leaf shapes over it, just to kind of fill it up a little bit. Again, if you had a blemish on a painting you didn't like, a big leaf can quite often cover it up. But I mean, you could spend ages doing really tiny leaves, or you know, really intricate branches and things, but I was just doing this one just to give you an idea of, you know, what a sort of quick one can look like. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hit subscribe to see my other videos. Check out the one of a foreground tree using a sponge if you haven't seen that, because that is a good way of doing a quick but realistic looking tree. Yeah, thanks again, and I will see you in the next video.